Thank you for joining us today for this Southern Legislative Conference SLC webinar entitled SLC States and Real ID Requirements. I am Sujit Kanagaretna, Fiscal Policy Manager for the Southern Legislative Conference, the Southern Office of the Council of State Governments here in Atlanta. I want to thank our distinguished panelists for setting aside time from their very busy schedules to be here with us and for providing us with the latest information on Real ID. Before we delve into the webinar, I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping items. You are all in listen-only mode. If you wish to ask a question, please use the question box on your GoToWebinar toolbar. You may type in a question at any time during the webinar, and we will get to them at the end. We will be recording this webinar and posting it on the CSG Knowledge Center website, knowledgecenter.csg.org, and the SLC website, slcatlanta.org. The Real ID Act of 2005 established minimum security standards for state-issued driver's licenses and identification cards and prohibited federal agencies from accepting, for official purposes, licenses and identification cards from states that do not meet these standards. Starting January 22, 2018, air travelers without a license from a compliant state or a state that has been granted an extension will be asked to provide alternate acceptable identification. Starting October 1, 2020, every traveler will need to present a Real ID compliant license or another acceptable form of identification for domestic air travel. Of the 15 SLC states, 6 are compliant with the Real ID requirements, 8 have received extensions and are working towards compliance, and 1 is non-compliant without an extension. This webinar will provide an overview of the latest trends associated with the Real ID requirements from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and a status report from 2 SLC states. One of these states is fully compliant and the other is in the process of securing compliance. We are honored to have with us today this afternoon an eminent panel of experts to address a number of issues related to Real ID. Our first presenter is Ted Sobel, Deputy Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. He is a Policy and Operations Specialist for Homeland Security screening and credentialing programs, including Real ID. Our second presenter is Burt Brantley, appointed Commissioner for the Georgia Department of Driver Services by Governor Nathan Deal in March 2016. Under his leadership, the department issues over 2 million secure IDs and licenses every year. Our final presenter is Karen St. Germain, appointed Commissioner of the Louisiana Office of Motor Vehicles by Governor John Bell Edwards in January 2016. Prior to this appointment, Commissioner St. Germain served in the Louisiana House of Representatives for 12 years, including the final 4 as chair of the Louisiana House of Representatives Transportation, Highways, and Public Works Committee, when she was actively engaged with the SLC in different capacities. Each presentation this afternoon will last about 15 minutes. Please feel free to submit your questions as they come up throughout the program, and we will try to answer as many as we have time at the end. Mr. Sobel, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. Actually, I think that's going to save us a couple of the slides. I'll jump right into this, so if you could proceed. Great. Just what I plan to cover is an overview of Real ID itself, where it comes from, what it requires, then give you a sense of where the states lie, both in aggregate and on a state-by-state basis, then just touch upon the enforcement schedule, and then provide a couple of tools that might help the listeners in their work. Next slide, please. First off, I think it's always important to understand the roots of the Real ID Act. It's really rooted in the findings of the 9/11 Commission. The 9/11 Commission found that the federal government should set standards for the issuance of birth certificates and sources of identification such as driver's licenses. It's really that last bit on driver's licenses that led to the Real ID Act. The reason the 9/11 Commission gave for this recommendation is that sources of identification are the last opportunity to ensure that people are who they say they are, and to do checks on whether they're terrorists. Next slide, please. What we have here is the sort of the big picture. The Real ID Act was enacted by Congress in 2005, covering 56 jurisdictions, 50 states, 5 territories, and the District of Columbia. Out of the sake of convenience, I am just going to use the word states and jurisdictions interchangeably, so hopefully that does not offend. What the Real ID Act does is establish minimum standards for secure issuance of state driver's licenses and ID cards, and it prohibits federal agencies from accepting for official purposes such licenses and ID cards unless the states meet those minimum requirements. So it's really that second part, the prohibition, is where the mandate of the Real ID Act lies. So it's a mandate on the federal government, not on the state governments. The Act authorizes the Secretary of Homeland Security to do 2 things: to determine if a state is meeting the minimum requirements of the Act. We base this upon the information provided by the states on their progress. Secondly, it authorizes the Secretary to grant an extension of time to states that are making progress in order to meet the requirements of the Act. The official term is that states that provide adequate justification for noncompliance. That roughly translates into demonstrating sufficient progress. The official purposes, as defined in the regulation, are accessing federal facilities, boarding federally regulated commercial aircraft, entering nuclear power plants. There is a 4th, more general provision in the Real ID Act, which authorizes the Secretary to add to that list, but successive secretaries have kept to the 3 official purposes that were actually described in the Act itself. Next slide, please. So what it does in a nutshell is it really attacks the concept of secure driver's licenses from three buckets of vulnerabilities. One is the information that a person provides. To the second is the security of the card itself, the physical security of the card. And finally, a broader list of what goes on behind the scenes. It's really the looking at the insider threat. So attacking those 3 prongs of security, to address the first one, the information provided by people, by the applicants, it requires the state to look at and verify documents proving identity and lawful status. Identity covering full legal name, date of birth, social security number, address of principal residence. Lawful status is a term that's defined in the Real ID Act. It's a little broader than what people generally think of. So it's not only just citizens and lawful permanent residents, but it's also smaller categories of individuals that are in the country legally, such as refugees or people under deferred action status. The second set of security requirements deals with the card design, setting what information needs to be included on the card, biographic information, digital photo, signature, and card number. I should note, despite some press reports, it does not require fingerprints. It requires the card itself to have physical anti-counterfeit security features, and on the back to use common machine-readable technology. In the final group, really the insider threat group of security requirements, deal with the copy and retention of source documents, the secure production of the facilities and the document materials, and ensuring that there's background checks and fraudulent document training for employees. Almost as importantly is what it does not do. It does not create a national ID card, does not create a federal database of driver information. It does not give the federal government access to state data. I will go on that it does not allow other states to poke around in a state's database. So a lot of those things tend to get misrepresented in the public, as it does do that when in fact it does not. Secondly, It does not authorize DHS to regulate the issuance of cards by states. Again, as I said in the previous slide, it is the law is very carefully crafted that it is a mandate on the federal government. It dictates the terms that the federal government may accept a driver's license for those official purposes, but it does not give DHS the authority to regulate the states themselves. Finally, it does not prevent any state from issuing a non-compliant card. A state that issues a compliant card, it can also issue a non-compliant card for any reason whatsoever. The only requirement is that we're essentially able to tell the difference between a compliant and a non-compliant card. Next slide, please. Status of states. I like to start off with the big picture. We are now at a point where 95% of standards are either met or in the progress of being met. In other words, the state has told us that they are planning to meet it, but maybe have to go through an IT refresh cycle or a budget cycle to be able to implement that commitment. So I mean, that comes out to 85% are actually met, 10% are plans to be met, and we're down to only 4% of the requirements states are not currently meeting or planning to meet. And there's one last group of insufficient information that really says there's one territory, the American Samoa, which has not provided DHS with an update, so we cannot evaluate where it stands in regards to implementing individual requirements. So again, big picture is the Real ID regulation, we group into 43 requirements, 43 standards. You multiply that by 56 jurisdictions. We have 22,408 total. That's our baseline. When we check 2,408 boxes, we have full national implementation of Real ID, and we're getting pretty close. Next slide, please. However, that does not trend, even though it's only 5% of the requirements left to be done or to be implemented. That does not translate evenly across the states. So for a state to be compliant, they must meet all 43 of those requirements. Currently, there are 24 states that meet that, including the most recent addition from earlier this year, which was Arizona. We have several other states that have told us that they are meeting it later this year, so we do expect that number to increase in the near future. So 24 states are compliant. There are 27 states that are non-compliant but had extensions, means that they've been able to demonstrate sufficient progress, that they are continuing to move towards compliance. And then finally, we have 5 states that are non-compliant without extension. We actually got an update from one of those states, so we actually expect that number to change in the near future as well. A note on extensions: the purpose of an extension under the law and under the regulation is to provide a state with additional time to meet the requirements. It's really envisioned for a state that is doing the work but needs the additional time to get there because they want to align it with their IT refresh cycle, again with budget cycles, with other reasons. That is really what an extension is designed for. It is not designed to be a permanent resting place for states that do not want to come into compliance. So essentially, each year when we look at states and whether to renew their extension, we're really evaluating what progress they are making, what are their plans for future progress, and that's really our guide on whether to grant the state an extension. Next slide, please. I won't get into this too much because I think that was actually pretty good in the introduction. The big picture is phases 1, 2, and 3 went off on schedule. That covers the official uses for federal facilities and nuclear power plants. The sole remaining official use that we need to that we will be phasing in, which is boarding commercial aircraft. Again, in 2018, it depends on for a passenger, it depends on what state issued their license. whether that state is compliant or has an extension or not. And then in October of 2020, it depends on what is the actual card in the person's wallet. Is the card itself a compliant card? So that's really the difference between the 2018 and 2020 milestones. Next slide, please. This, again, is more provided as a tool than anything else. As I said earlier, a state can issue a compliant card and a non-compliant card. Here's a list of several states that have done so. Like I said, they need to be marked both in design and with wording so that we can distinguish a compliant card from a non-compliant card. But we do have some room for flexibility in what the actual wording is. So we thought it would be a helpful tool to states to be able to provide a list of what some of the wording that has been approved from other states. I note the last two categories, the last two states on the list, California and Illinois, are currently not compliant states. However, since they did decide to issue cards for persons that would ultimately not be able to get a compliant card, they went ahead and started to mark those cards in a way that would be that would ensure that they don't have to replace those cards when and if the state does become compliant. Next slide. This is really a list of resources that are available for more information on Real ID. You've got the link to the Real ID Act itself, to the regulation, the overview of what our phase enforcement looks like, then the 2005 implementation guide, which is the guide used by federal facilities on how to enforce Real ID. And then with that is also the Interagency Security Committee standard that gives a broader discussion about the risk management process for federal facilities. Next slide. Finally, I want to leave you with a link to our website, a list of email contact information, both for the Real ID Program Office as a whole, as well with our individual team members and what areas they work with. In particular, I think this group will want to highlight Steve Kozar. I will actually have to step away from this panel momentarily, and Steve will fill in for me to answer questions. But Steve Kozar is really our expert in working with states to answer questions on what are the requirements for compliance, and also to provide information on best practices followed by other states in implementing the Real ID requirements. And then finally, I leave you with my email address. If you have any questions, always happy to be of service. So with that, I think I hit my 10-minute mark and would like to turn it back over.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Sobol, for those insightful remarks. Commissioner Brantley, you have the floor.
Well, good afternoon. Georgia is glad to be here today. I want to say a quick thanks to Ted before he gets off the phone. DHS and Ted have been a great help to Georgia in terms of just bouncing ideas and questions off of. So thanks to those guys for being a big help as we look to implement Real ID. And so you can go ahead and go to the next slide. Just for background purposes on Georgia, we fully implemented all the requirements, all the 43 that Ted mentioned in July of 2012, and then 6 months later in December, we were deemed to be compliant. And as we'll walk through, we had taken a number of steps before that to be ready to do that, and so we were glad to be part. We had gubernatorial support both from the previous governor, and our current governor as well, and so we were certainly an early adopter and an eager adopter as well. So next slide. So as I mentioned, we were what we would consider well positioned. DDS had required applicants to provide proof of identity and citizenship, lawful status, We were also electronically verifying Social Security numbers and using SAVE, and we were also scanning certain documents as well. So we were already doing a number of the requirements even before Real ID and before the implementation in 2012. Okay, next slide. We had also gone through a major system modernization in 2009, and so we had introduced a new card, a new issuance system, a new process. We had really just gone through that process, and so all of those requirements we either met or exceeded the Real ID standard. So again, we were just in really good shape and able to implement this technology-wise without too heavy of a lift. Okay, next slide. From a legislature point of view, back in 2007, the legislature in Georgia passed Senate Bill 5, and what that did is it gave the governor and DDS the ability to comply with Real ID only after it was shown that adequate safeguards have been defined and were in place. And so our legislature only meets from January to April each year, and so this was a way to give the department and the governor the ability to comply with Real ID, but only after certain these safeguards were in place. And so obviously it was 5 years later before we implemented it, but we didn't have to go back to the legislature to get additional approval. That Senate Bill 5 from 2007 allowed us to implement once we hit those safeguards. And then of course we had agency rules and regulations to amend, and our board approved those and aligned those with the federal rules that were issued. Okay, next slide. So we felt like Georgia had a number of factors that led us to be an early implementer and adopter of Real ID, which, by the way, in Georgia we call it Secure ID. That's the nomenclature that we use here. We have obviously a diverse workforce, and Fortune 500 companies have a substantial economic presence here. We have, in the last 3 years, ranked #1 in business climate, so there's a lot of economic progress here, and the business community is certainly a big part of Georgia's economic success. And so we had a number of economic reasons to do this. And the next slide, please. Probably the #1 reason is that we are home to the world's busiest airport in terms of passengers. And so when you have 100 million passengers passing through, of course a lot of those are connecting, but a lot of those are also either Georgians or people coming to Atlanta to originate their trip. You know, we felt like, Ted showed the deadlines earlier, we felt like if there was going to be a deadline for flights, for people to have a Real ID compliant card, that we needed to get on that in a hurry, since we have a high number of citizens here that either work in the airline industry or use airlines frequently. We also have a number of bases, federal installations here, and so there were a number of reasons why we felt like it was important to get Real ID compliant. In case any of those deadlines came up, we didn't want our citizens to be at a disadvantage. Okay, next slide. So go over real quickly some of the outreach that we did ahead of time, and you know, this was critical in informing the citizens what was coming, but also so that we could prove that we had done as much as we could to inform people. As I'm sure everybody on this call knows, it's hard to inform people about something like this until it's real to them. And so we had a multifaceted outreach campaign to try to reach them even before they were on their way to the driver's license center. So we did statewide PSAs, online advertising, both with news outlets and social media, and then we also developed some collateral to pass out to business partners, to our government partners, really anybody that would let us get out information, we were doing everything we could to inform the public about the changes that were coming. Okay, next slide. So we had also partnerships such as Rotary clubs where we could go and speak. Really any group that would allow us to come and reach an audience, because what we felt like is that we could get in front of people, we could tell them what was about to happen, and then hopefully they would tell their friends, and we could get some word of mouth going as well. Of course, we also used our website and then press releases out to the media for them to help us spread the word as well. We also sent notice to customers. So of course we have everybody's expiration date and birthdays, and addresses, and then some email addresses. So we were able to send out notice to people that we expected to come and visit the center because we could tell when they were scheduled to come in. And so we tried to send out advance notice to them as well. Okay, next slide. Here are some of the ads that we use both online and in print, and really that's, we tried to, obviously it's a dense topic, and we wanted to get as much information as we could, but in an ad you can only convey so much, and so you see there what we did both sort of vertically and horizontally there to meet whatever specifications the advertiser had for us, but we really wanted to get the list of documents in there. We didn't want to make people read an ad and then go to our website to get a list of documents. We really wanted to try to get that list out there and repeat it as much as possible. So you see in all three of those ads, the list of documents is right there in the ad. Of course, with the date July 1st, the date that we went into implementation. Okay, next slide. So as you might guess, we experienced an initial spike in customer wait time, and mainly that's our staff adjusting to the new process. Obviously, this was a dramatic change for our team members, and we make changes, it seems like all the time, but this was a wholesale change in the way that we were interacting with customers, what we were looking for from them, and so this really was even though we had been doing a number of the requirements already, the actual implementation was a significant change. We saw a number of customers have to make return visits, so the ads obviously didn't reach everybody, and so they were used to only bring in maybe their old license, or even if they thought to bring a birth certificate or passport, they might not have had their Social Security card with them. So we saw a number of customers making return visits. Obviously, I think you all know that if somebody comes in the center, they wait, they go and visit our team member, and they have to come back. That gums up the system, and so we saw a significant increase in wait times, in part because of the return visits as well. And then, of course, senior customers as well, on the name change documents for people that have changed their name because of marriage, having to have those marriage documents and divorce decrees and those kind of things. They were just surprised by it. In many cases, they hadn't kept up with those documents, and so it required them not only going home and coming back, but maybe even going to the county courthouse where they were married. But a number of things we were asking our customers to do they were not used to doing. Okay, next slide. And so to deal with these challenges, we hired and trained 22 new full-time positions and then 66 temporary positions. That was in fiscal year 2013, so that year starts in July of 2012 and ends in June of 2013. And so we sent those temporary and part-time staff out to help out with our full-time staff. We also opened some locations on Mondays. So we are typically closed on Monday so that we can be open on Saturday. And with obviously Saturdays being a big day for kids to come in and get their license, we were typically open on Saturday. So we opened some locations on Mondays, some of our busier locations, and offered those overtime opportunities to staff that wanted to work on Mondays as well and earn a little extra money to help us get through this, what we hoped was a short-term period. Next slide. We also made some other improvements in terms of process, and so we had employees out working the line even before the center opened, because we had lines before people lining up before the center opened. We had people making sure, going through their documents to make sure they had everything in order before reaching the counter. If we could catch somebody outside before they ever got there and turn them around to go back and get additional documents, that saved on our counter time and helped us manage the queue that had backed up. We also stood up an internal help desk, and so our field staff could call in to our help desk internally and ask questions. And so we had that. We've always had a contact center for customers to call. This is actually a contact center, a help desk for our field staff to be able to call in. Of course, they get right in without having to wait and be able to ask the question from our staff here at headquarters. We also expanded the list of acceptable documents, and we allowed, if you didn't have a proof of residency or your Social Security documents with you, you could submit those back. So we essentially issued you a temporary interim license, and you could submit those documents either by fax, mail, or online, and then we would send out your permanent license after we received those and verified those. So a number of things to try to get at what we will show you in a second why we were so intent on doing that. Next slide. So we also installed additional hardware and scanners. Scanning continues to be a challenge, and having as many scanners as possible and those that work is very important. We also deploy what we call business center computers, and so this is a computer with internet access attached to a printer, and that allows them to print some documents. Maybe potentially they can prove their residency by printing out a phone bill or a water bill, or Social Security. There's a way to go in the Social Security website and print out proof of Social Security number as well if you can answer a bunch of questions. And so we deployed those computers to allow people to try to cut back on the return visit if it was those documents that they needed. We also set up an interface with our Vital Records department so we could electronically verify birth certificates if they were born here in Georgia. So again, a number of technological improvements to try to stop those return visits, people leaving and having to come back. That really is where their frustration kicked in. Having to wait a long time and then being told you had to come back can be very frustrating. Okay, next slide. So here's the reason why we were so intent on making those improvements, because if you look at the 4 weeks prior to implementation, our average renewal time went up from 35 minutes to 2 hours and 7 minutes across the state. So, you know, more than 3 times, almost 4 times the wait time there. What our goal of serving customers within 30 minutes dropped from 46% to 22% across the state, and then our average transaction time went up as well. So all that, we had more people coming in, we had longer time at the counter, all of that led to these significant wait times up above 2 hours. And you can imagine at that point we had media coverage, and so if the preliminary outreach before implementation didn't alert people, the media coverage certainly did, because we were leading the news most nights with lines wrapped around the corner. And so they didn't pay attention before, but once we implemented, everybody was paying attention at that point. Everybody knew what was going on. Okay, next slide. So here you see the blue bar is the number of driver's licenses and IDs issued, and you see a general upward trend. You know, not a significant spike, but there certainly were some people who came in because they had heard about needing this secure ID, and so they came in to get one. And so a little bit of a trend up, but really mostly, as I mentioned earlier, it was the increased time at the counter, the increased people of coming back, having for a second trip. Of course, they would only be counted once in the number of driver's licenses issued. And so that led to the green line, which is certainly a general trend downward. This is the month after implementation. This is for July. Okay, next slide. So you see by March of 2013, we had issued 1 million secure IDs, you know, as our staff got to be more comfortable with the process, as the technology got out, the business center computers, we really started to get on top of the wait times. and we really started to see a number of folks getting their secure IDs in a reasonable amount of time, which obviously we were very proud of. All right, next slide, which I think is the last one. So we now have 5.7 million of our 8 million plus cardholders have been enrolled, and they possess a Real ID compliant card. That's roughly 60%, maybe getting towards 65%. We enroll about 1 million customers each year, and on that pace, we think that by mid-2017, so by this time next year, over 90% of Georgia cardholders will possess a Real ID. We did have some 10-year term licenses that were available before implementation, so there are a number of customers who I think can go out to almost 2019 before having to come back to the center and get a compliant card. So we still will be catching up with those folks over the next few years, but the vast majority of Georgia cardholders will be compliant by the middle of next year. So I think that's all. Yes, that's it for me.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner, for that presentation. Madam Commissioner, you have the floor.
Good afternoon. I just want to tell both presenters, Mr. Brantley and Mr. Ted, what a great job they just did. I think that my Deputy Commissioner, Ms. Stacy Hoyt, is well known by everybody. She's sitting by me in case I need a little help. Usually I'm behind the table, not in front of the table. Good afternoon, and I'll skip over the next slide, this one and the next one. Thanks. Since Mr. Ted gave such a great job of all of that, Stacy said she should have figured, but we just thought we'd put a little bit in. I'll kind of start off with the legislative history. In 2014, as you all know, we had House Bill 907, and it was passed. It was done by me, and there were a lot of discussions. We have a very strong right-wing group within our legislative body then and now. But at that moment in time, we convinced them that we were going to do it right, follow the rules, and make sure everybody's data was very secure. When it got to the governor's desk, as you know, he vetoed it, then Bobby Jindal, and it was all political, which is really sad, but that's what happens, and we all know that. Fear of losing his political campaign contributions, and look, this is all truth, that's why I put it on slide, and his aspirations of being president. Next slide. In 2016, and I'm fast forwarding because this is the good year, on House Bill 702 by Representative Jimmy Harris and Representative Terry Landry was submitted, and Senate Bill 227, Senator Bohm. We asked for and received a legislative draft on each side so that we were kind of backing ourselves up on having one come out one way or the other. Kind of a determination, I guess, after Stacy and her staff and myself as a legislator in 2014, we were ready. We have 4 options to ours. You have an ID compliant card, or an ID not compliant card, or a driver's license compliant or not compliant. Mr. Brantley, I think we learned a great number of things from Georgia. I'm not happy they happened to you, but I'm happy we had your history. Next slide. Our challenges, one of our greatest challenges is going to be going back to our legislature for every change. I did not add that in, but this morning as I was looking, that is one thing we had to agree to, and making sure our networking and our privacy issues were, as we said, participating with entities will only share information for the purposes of verification and do not share actual data. Photographs, we are definitely required to identify applicants and eliminate fraud. Biometrics big deal. Even though Louisiana is not capable of capturing biometric images, it became one of the main issues during the conversation this year of convincing those certain groups that we were not capable of sending anyone biometric information. Is Louisiana ready? Next slide. Is Louisiana ready for Real ID? We have been ready to implement Real ID since probably before 2014, but right at 2014. Majority of the Real ID benchmarks have been existing OMB practices clearly outlined in Louisiana statute for years. Minor modifications are needed in the considered Real ID compliant with Homeland Security. Marking the credential with a compliant star or non-compliant verbiage indicating the credential cannot be utilized for federal identification purposes. Obtaining DHS approval of Louisiana's Real ID plan. Proof of residency resolved in our 2016 Real ID bills, and presentation of the reader documents that Ted talked about earlier resolved in also our 2016 ID bills. By the way, both bills are pretty close to identical. We are going to have the governor sign them both, and we're going to have them done in the order that we know is the best for the purposes of the last intent of the legislature. And he definitely has agreed to sign them. His only request was opt-in, opt-out. Where are we now? We were granted that extension by Real ID DHS through October 10th, 2016, and I'm sorry. Louisiana will now be considered eligible for an additional extension if needed because of House Bill 702 and House Bill 227, but all of me is hoping that this is all good to go. Important dates for us, 2018 will be considered a Real ID compliant state. All Louisiana credentials, next slide. It's that Cajun in me talking fast. Louisiana will be considered a Real ID compliant state. All credentials, regardless if marked compliant or not, will be accepted for TSA for air travel. Non-compliant states will be unable to utilize their credentials. 10-2020, all air travel will require a TSA-approved document. Non-compliant DLs or IDs will not be accepted, and I know I'm being a little repetitive. Louisiana's future. Next slide. Campaign slogan, Louisiana first. That was his. That's ours, and we follow it. He's a man that I worked with for 8 years in the legislature, true to his word, and loves the state of Louisiana. So signing the Real ID bills is one example of him keeping his promise to the whole state as he went through it during election. 2 duplicate Real ID bills passed, and where both duplicates have passed, and they are headed to his desk for signature as of today. That wasn't in the slide earlier because that just happened yesterday. Louisiana's next slide. Louisiana OMB statistical data, that's just driver's licenses that we do yearly, about 3 million.
Total, not even. Total DLs.
It's total, okay. Total DLs, 9,500,000 vehicle registrations maintained. We have 79 field offices. We have 500 employees. About 7 or 8 years ago, we had right around 900 employees. In the past, Governor also, it was called Streamline, and I won't go into that. 2016 operating budget, our operating budget is $52 million a year. Of course, we don't just do licenses, we do registration and several other things. OMB operates on less than 5% of the revenue we collect. We collect for local and state governments and a lot of other agencies, and our annual collections are $1.1 billion. Next slide. Ending on this note, this is our sample. For purposes, there may be a little change depending on
The class of license.
the class of license, and that's about it from us. We're kind of in the middle of the process, ready to get started and have some time to implement this. We're ready to go, but there are some things we just have to get approved for and make sure. Mr. Ted, I think we're ready to do that. And our contact information, and next slide, is probably things you already have for Stacy, but this is mine, and I'm more than happy to talk to anyone across the country that would like our help if they so need to.
Excellent.
Thanks.
That was a great presentation, Madam Commissioner. Thank you so much. We did receive several questions during the webinar, and the first one goes to Mr. Kozar. This involves the enormous costs associated with implementing Real ID. While the federal government has provided grants to states that are moving towards compliance, these grants expected to cover the full cost of implementation. Could you please provide some possible details on the state of the grants?
Well, the grants have already been allocated, and there's no more grants available specifically for Real ID. The grants were initially intended to give the states some money to help with the secure process of their driver's licenses. So all the grant funds that were specifically dedicated for Real ID have been allocated, and there's no specific grant money specifically allocated for Real ID anymore. Now, that doesn't say that states can't utilize some of their other Homeland Security money for Real ID purposes, but that's the decision that the state has to make on itself, whether it wants to utilize that funding for that or not.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Mr. Kozar. We have a question for Commissioner Brantley. Given that Georgia has been fully compliant with Real ID for a number of years now, what would you cite as the most difficult challenge faced by the state in securing compliance, and what recommendations would you offer to states that are in the process of reaching the full goal of compliance?
Well, the most difficult challenge, thankfully, we had done much of the lift. We had done a lot of the technological upgrades that we needed to do with our new system and with some of the requirements that we were asking of our citizens already. So that really depends on sort of where you're currently at and where you need to get to. We didn't have that long of a road to hoe, and so if I guess our best suggestion would be you might want to try to do that gradually if you can. We had already done a number of those things, thankfully, so the lift was heavy, even though we had done a number of those improvements already. And then, I just can't stress enough the public outreach piece of it. I mean, we tried as hard as we could, and we let as many people know as we could, but we still ended up with lots of folks who showed up and didn't know, and we still had to catch up, and it took us, really a month to really get ahead of the curve and get wait times back down to something reasonable. And so anything you can do on the outreach standpoint, have we had some of those business center computers and some of those additional processes in place that I discussed, had we had some of those in beforehand, then certainly I think that would have helped the transition. Anything you can do to not send people home is advisable. That frustrates them, and it counts. They visit twice. They wait in line twice as long, and so anything you can do to stop from people having to go home, I think is a great lesson learned. And then something that we did that I would certainly encourage anyone who's in the process of implementing. We had essentially a war room, if you want to call it that, and we had the attitude of being very nimble as we were going live. I was not here during that point, but I can tell you from from a customer standpoint, which I was at the time, and talking to the staff here, having people in the room who can make decisions and who weren't afraid to make decisions was very critical. We could change a process literally, overnight and be ready to open the next morning with a new rule or a new procedure in place. And you don't have the capability to sit back and think for a long time before making a decision. You got to be ready to go. You got to have the people in the room who's willing to make the decision. So anything that you can do during implementation, for the first month or two, to have those people on hand and ready to make a decision, I think is really critical and really helped us get on top of the curve, because we were behind it for a little while, but we caught up in about a month. We got those procedures changed, got the computers out, and we're able to catch back up and get back to a pretty reasonable experience within about a month or so.
Very good. We also have a question for Commissioner St. Germain. I know the debate in Louisiana these past few weeks have included concerns in some sectors about privacy, storage, and the use of personal information. In particular, concerns have been raised about data from one state being made available electronically to all the other states and possibly federal authorities through a system administered by AMVA, that is the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators. Would you like to comment on these privacy concerns, Madam Commissioner?
Yes, sir, we have. We've been looking at this for a couple of years now and pretty much knew what they didn't want us to do, but we also know what we didn't want to do. And we know the security of their driver's license is of utmost importance. So we actually, in the legislation, it specifies we had to do a lot of verbiage that somebody could read and completely understand that their information was not being shared with anybody. It was for within Louisiana, within the state.
Okay, very good.
Just Stacy, hold on a second.
I think the privacy concerns that our citizens had was from lack of knowledge of how we do compare data back and forth between states. We don't actually share the data between states. Their concern was like the Georgia DMV was going to be able to log into our database and run people's records. They just have a lack of understanding of how the infrastructure at AMVA works.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for all those comments. We are running out of time and have to wrap up this webinar, but please forward any questions you have to me and I will work on getting you a response from the presenters. Thank you to our speakers today for their contributions and to my CSG colleague Carrie Abner for her help with all the technical aspects. Thank you to all of you for spending an hour of your afternoon with us, and I hope you found this webinar on Real ID useful and informative. If there's anything more that CSG or SLC can do for you in your work, please don't hesitate to contact us. Have a great afternoon.